I was sitting alone on a park bench on a Saturday morning, the way I had done every week for 10 years, when two small children ran up and pointed at my wrist. "Sir, how come you have the same tattoo as our mom?" I could not breathe. That tattoo existed in one place only, and the woman who designed it had been gone for 10 years. When their mother came running toward us and saw my arm, she stopped cold. What she said next pulled the ground out from under 10 years of my life. "You are watching Revenge, Dad, and I'm incredibly thankful for your presence. Where are you tuning in from today? Let me know your city or country in the comments. Please note, this story includes some creative elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarities to actual names or places are accidental, but the ultimate message is highly valuable. My name is Walter Grayson, and I am 72 years old, and I have been sitting on this same bench every Saturday morning for 10 years. Not because I love this park, not because the coffee from the cart near the entrance is particularly good, though Felix, the man who runs it, always hands me my cup with a nod that feels like something close to kindness. I come here because this bench is the one place in my week where nobody expects anything from me. Not a decision, not a signature, not a composed expression across a conference table. I can sit here with my coffee going cold in my hand and the October leaves coming down around me in that slow, unhurried way they fall when there is no wind. And I do not have to be Walter Grayson, founder of Grayson Construction, employer of 412 people across the state of California. I can just be the old man on the bench who misses his wife. Pasadena on a Saturday morning has its own particular quality of light. The San Gabriel Mountains sit behind the city, like a promise somebody made and mostly kept. And in October, the air carries a crispness that does not belong to Southern California by rights, but shows up anyway as if the season is trying. I have watched this park change across 10 years of Saturday mornings. The oak tree near the east gate has grown wide enough now that its shadow reaches the path by 9 o'clock. A family of ducks took up residence in the fountain 3 years ago, and nobody has moved them. Children who were small enough to chase pigeons when I first started coming here are now old enough to sit on their own benches and stare at their phones. Time does what time does. It moves, whether you want it to or not. I looked down at my right hand wrapped around the paper cup, and I saw the tattoo the way I see it every morning, which is without really seeing it at all anymore, the way you stop seeing a photograph you have lived with long enough. A compass with a broken needle, a single branch, no leaves, no flower. A bird caught mid-flight, neither arriving nor departing, suspended between the two. Maggie drew the design. That is the part people do not know, the part I have never told anyone, because telling it would require explaining everything that came before and after it, and I have spent 10 years learning that grief is not a story that benefits from being told in full to people who were not there for it. She drew it on the back of a paper bag at our kitchen table on a Wednesday night in 1989, the year we had been married 4 years and were young enough to still believe that love required ceremony to make it permanent. "I want something that belongs to both of us," she said, pushing the paper across the table toward me. "Not rings. We already have rings. Something we made ourselves." I looked at the sketch. The compass needle bent in the middle, pointing nowhere specific. The branch reaching up without a flower at the end. The bird between places. "This is a sad drawing," I told her. She laughed and shook her head. "No, it isn't. The needle is broken because we don't need to know where we're going, as long as we're going there together. The branch doesn't have a flower yet, because the best part hasn't happened yet. And the bird isn't lost." She tapped the paper. "The bird is just not there yet. That's different from lost." I got the tattoo the following Saturday. She got the other half the week after. I did not see her design until the artist had finished and the bandage came off, and when I saw it, I understood what she meant. Her compass needle bent the same way mine did, but pointed in the opposite direction. Her branch was the mirror of mine. Her bird faced the other way. Together, the two tattoos made one complete image. Separately, each of us carried half. I had not seen the other half in 10 years. Grayson Construction started as a two-man operation in a rented warehouse in Burbank in 1981 myself, and a partner named Dennis, who left after 3 years to open a restaurant that failed and then a second restaurant that succeeded, and after Dennis left, it was just me and whatever I could build with the hours in a day. We built it into something real, custom residential, then commercial, then the kind of large-scale projects that have your name on a plaque at the entrance to buildings that will stand long after you are gone. By the time Maggie passed, the company employed over 400 people and operated in 6 California counties. Now, Elliot runs it. My son, 45 years old, sharp in the way I taught him to be sharp decisive in the way the business demands decisiveness. I handed it to him 18 months after the accident because I could not be in the boardroom and inside my grief at the same time, and I chose the grief. Not a choice I regret, but a choice with consequences I am still understanding. I raised my coffee cup and drank what was left of it, which was cold and slightly bitter in the way coffee gets when it has been sitting long enough to give up on being warm. Around me, the park was filling in the gradual way parks fill on Saturday mornings, joggers and dog walkers, and young parents pushing strollers with the focused exhaustion of people who have not slept past 6 in months. I was thinking about nothing in particular, which was the point of the bench, which was the point of Saturday. Then I heard them. 2 sets of small feet hitting the path. At a run, the particular rhythm of children who are moving as fast as their legs will carry them, because no other speed has occurred to them as an option. I looked up from my empty cup and saw them coming around the bend in the path, 2 small figures in matching yellow jackets, dark-haired, bright-eyed, moving with the total commitment of children who have somewhere very important to be and have decided that somewhere is directly in front of my bench. They stopped, both of them at the same moment as if they had rehearsed it. The girl on the left looked at my face. Then she looked down at my right hand. Then she looked at my face again with the particular expression of a child who has just recognized something and is working out what to do with the information. She pointed at my wrist. And she said, "Sir, how come you have the same tattoo as our mom?" I did not move. I do not think I breathed. The girl stood no taller than my shoulder would be if I were standing, which I was not. She had dark eyes and the particular expression of a child who has asked a perfectly reasonable question and sees no reason why an adult should find it difficult to answer. Beside her, the boy, same dark eyes, same yellow jacket, same patient waiting expression, looked from my wrist to my face and back again, as if he were cross-referencing 2 pieces of information that did not quite resolve. I looked down at my wrist, the compass with the broken needle, the branch with no flower, the bird between places. "The same tattoo," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "Not exactly the same," the girl said, with the precision of a child who believes accuracy matters. "Ours has the bird going the other way, and the branch curves different, but the broken compass thing is the same, and the bird is the same kind of bird." She tilted her head. "Mom says it's her most special thing. She never lets us touch it." The boy nodded to confirm this as fact. I set my coffee cup down on the bench beside me because my hand had developed a tremor I did not trust. 35 years I had worn this tattoo. Hundreds of people had seen it over those years, at job sites and dinner tables and doctors' offices, and a handful had asked about it, and I had always given some version of the same short answer, something my wife and I did a long time ago, and they had nodded and moved on because that was a complete enough answer for most people. Nobody had ever said anything that cracked the whole structure of the answer open. "What's your mom's name?" I asked. "Nora," the boy said. "Nora Sutton. We're June and Sam. I'm Sam." "We're twins," June added as if this might not be apparent. "Identical, but I'm 4 minutes older, so I'm technically the responsible one." Sam's expression suggested he disputed this characterization, but had made peace with losing that particular argument. I looked at the tattoo again. I needed to think clearly, and my mind was not cooperating. Maggie had designed this image herself on the back of a paper bag at our kitchen table on a Wednesday night in October of 1989. She had not copied it from anywhere. There was no flash sheet, no reference book, no image she had seen and adapted. It came entirely from her, from whatever was alive inside her, on that particular evening that needed a shape to live in. After she died, I had gone back to the tattoo parlor on Colorado Boulevard, where we had both gotten our ink done, looking for, I did not know what. Some connection to the day. The artist who had done our tattoos, a quiet man named Hector, who worked with a focus that bordered on reverence, had retired 2 years before Maggie passed and moved to New Mexico to be near his grandchildren. The woman who ran the shop told me Hector had never kept copies of custom designs. "He said the design belongs to the person," she told me, "not to him." So, the design lived in 2 places, on my right wrist and on Maggie's left. And Maggie had been in the ground for 10 years. "Your mom," I said carefully, Does she have it on her left wrist? June's eyes went wide. How did you know that? My chest did something I had no name for. Not pain exactly. Not the grief I had become so familiar with that I sometimes confused it for my own personality. Something else, something with an edge to it that cut in a direction I had not felt in a very long time. Where is your mom right now? I asked. She was right behind us, Sam said, turning to look back down the path. We kinda ran ahead a little. A lot, June corrected. She knows where we are. She definitely does not know where we are. I stood up from the bench. My legs held, which was more than I had expected of them. The park continued around me the way parks do, indifferent to whatever was dismantling itself inside my chest. A jogger passing on the path, a dog pulling at its leash near the fountain, the ordinary Saturday machinery of the world, running exactly as it always had. I looked down at June and Sam, who looked up at me with the calm, assessing patience of children who had asked a complicated question, and were genuinely interested in whatever answer was coming. Has your mom ever told you, I said, about where she got that tattoo? June nodded slowly. She says a lady gave it to her. A really special lady she used to take care of when she was a nurse. She says the lady changed her life. She paused. She cried the one time she told us about it. Mom doesn't cry very much, so we remembered. The breath went out of me. A nurse, a lady she used to take care of. A lady who changed her life. I pressed my thumb against the tattoo on my wrist, the way I had done 10,000 times in 10 years, without knowing why, and I felt the familiar raised lines of ink under my skin. And I thought about Maggie sitting at our kitchen table, drawing this image out of nothing, out of love, out of the particular way she saw the world. There is no way, I told myself. There is absolutely no rational way. Then I heard a woman's voice from somewhere down the path, behind the children, high and urgent and moving fast in our direction. June, Sam, do not move. I am coming to you right now. She came around the bend in the path, at something between a fast walk and a run, the particular gait of a parent who has decided that running would confirm the panic she was working hard not to feel. She was younger than I had expected, mid-30s maybe, with dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested it had started the morning neater than it currently was. She wore a gray jacket over scrub pants, and the expression of a woman who had done the calculation of everything that could go wrong in the 90 seconds she had lost visual contact with her children and had not liked any of the results. She reached June and Sam and put both hands on their shoulders simultaneously. The checking hands, the inventory hands, the we are all here and accounted for hands that parents develop without being taught. I told you to stay on the path, she said, and her voice carried equal parts relief and exhaustion in the specific ratio of a parent who has had this conversation before and expects to have it again. We did stay on the path, Sam said. This is the path. You know what I meant. The man has a tattoo like yours, Mom, June said with the urgency of someone delivering information she considered long overdue. The woman looked up at me for the first time. I saw her take me in the way people assess strangers' age, posture, threat level, whether the situation requires apology or alarm. She opened her mouth to say something that was probably going to be an apology for her children's abrupt introduction into my Saturday morning. Then her eyes dropped to my right wrist, and she stopped. Not the polite pause of someone noticing something mildly interesting. A full stop. The kind that happens when your body receives information your mind has not yet caught up to processing. Her hands were still on her children's shoulders, but her grip had loosened and her face had done something complicated that I could not entirely read. She stared at my wrist for what felt like a long time, but was probably 4 seconds. I'm sorry, she said, but the apology was automatic, disconnected from whatever was actually happening behind her eyes. I'm so sorry they run ahead sometimes, and She stopped herself, looked at my wrist again, then at my face. Did you design that yourself? Yes, I said, a long time ago. She exhaled through her nose, a short controlled breath, the kind you take when you are trying to slow something down that wants to move faster than you can manage. Both parts, she said. The compass and the branch and the bird. You designed all 3 elements yourself. My wife drew the original sketch, I said. I transferred it. Neither of us copied it from anywhere. Something moved across her face that I could not name. She straightened up slowly, and then she did something I had not anticipated. She reached down and pushed the left sleeve of her jacket up past her wrist. Not dramatically, not as an announcement, just the quiet, deliberate motion of someone who needs to show you something and has decided that now is the time. I looked at her wrist. My heart did not stop. That is not what happens in real life, whatever people say. What happened was that my heart continued beating with the sudden mechanical awareness of a thing that has been doing its job without being noticed and has abruptly become very, very noticeable, beating hard and present and inescapable in my chest. The compass with the broken needle, the single branch, the bird in flight. Not identical to mine. June had been right about that. The bird faced the other direction, the branch curved slightly differently. But the elements were the same. The feeling behind them was the same. The hand that had made them was the same hand. I was certain of it, with a certainty I could not have explained to a jury, but would have staked everything I owned on. "Where did you get that?" My voice came out lower than I intended. "From a woman I took care of," she said. "At a nursing home in Tennessee. I was her nurse for 4 years." She paused and I watched her decide how much to say. "When I left, I had this put on my wrist because I wanted to carry something of hers with me. She never told me what it meant, but she let me photograph it, and I took the photograph to an artist and I asked him to put it on me." She looked at her wrist, then back at me. "I didn't know it was a one-of-a-kind design. I just knew it mattered to her more than anything else she owned." The park continued around us. June and Sam had gone quiet with the rare instinctive quiet of children who understand that the adults have entered territory that does not belong to children not yet, and who have chosen to wait rather than interrupt. "Tennessee," I said. "Knoxville," she said. "A place called Cedarwood Nursing Home. I worked there from 2016 to 2020. 2016 to 2020? My wife had been gone since 2014. This woman," I said, and I had to stop and rebuild the sentence because the first version of it did not come out right. "This woman you took care of. What was her name?" She looked at me steadily, and I could see her making the calculation, the same one I was making, the same impossible arithmetic that kept producing an answer neither of us was ready to say out loud. "The name in her file," she said carefully, "was Eleanor Marsh." She held my gaze without looking away. But I never believed that was her real name, not after the first year, not after I got to know her. The leaves came down around the bench in the particular unhurried way of October. June leaned against her mother's arm. Sam watched me with the patient, serious expression of a 7-year-old who has decided this is important. I sat back down on the bench because standing had become something I was no longer sure I could sustain. "Sit with me," I said. "Please, I need you to tell me everything." She looked at her children, then at me, and she sat. She did not begin immediately. She sent June and Sam to the stretch of grass 20 feet away, with instructions to stay where she could see them, and June negotiated briefly for the right to chase the pigeons near the fountain, and Nora agreed to this with the automatic permission granting of a parent whose attention had already moved on to something larger. Sam went without negotiating, because Sam, I was learning, was the kind of person who read a room and adjusted accordingly. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at me and began. "I started at Cedarwood in January of 2016, she said. "It's a mid-sized facility, about 90 residents, private pay, mostly on the east side of Knoxville. I took the job because the hours worked with my kids' school schedule, and the pay was better than the hospital I'd been at before." She paused. "Eleanor Marsh was assigned to my care rotation in my second week." "What did her intake file say?" I asked. "That's the thing I kept coming back to," Nora said. "The file was thin, unusually thin for a long-term resident. Date of admission, September of 2014. Age listed as 63. No family contacts. Emergency contact was a phone number that stopped working sometime in 2015. I tried it myself once just to see. No insurance information beyond a private account that paid her monthly fees automatically." She looked down at her hands. "Most of our residents had files 3 inches thick. Medical history, family contacts, previous doctors, living, will's power of attorney documentation. Eleanor Marsh had 11 pages. Did anyone question that? The administrator told me the paperwork had been handled by the family at intake and everything was in order." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I was new. I let it go. For a while." She told me about the first months. Eleanor Marsh kept to herself, which was not unusual. She was polite to the staff, ate what was brought to her, slept regular hours. She was, by every clinical measure, a cooperative patient. But Nora had noticed something in those early months that she could not put into a chart note. She watched the door, Nora said. Not the way confused residents do not looking for something they've lost. She watched it the way a person watches something they have a specific feeling about. Aware, present. Like she was always keeping track of who came in and who went out. I thought about Maggie, the way she used to sit facing the entrance of any restaurant we went to, back straight, eyes moving. I had teased her about it once. She said her mother had taught her to always know where the exits were. Did she ever talk about herself? I asked. About her life before? Almost never, Nora said. In 4 years, she told me 3 things about her past. She had been married for a very long time to a man she loved. She had a son, and she had lived in California. Nora's voice was even careful, each word placed deliberately. She never said the son's name. She never said her husband's name. She never said which part of California. The pigeons near the fountain scattered as June ran through them, arms wide. Sam watched from the edge of the grass, with his hands in his jacket pockets, evaluating the strategic wisdom of his sister's approach. I pressed my thumb against my wrist without thinking about it. The tattoo, I said. When did you first see it? About 3 months in, Nora said. I was changing a bandage on her forearm. She'd caught it on the edge of her nightstand and her sleeve pulled back. She saw me looking and she pulled her arm back. Gently, not angry, but deliberate. Nora turned her own wrist over in her lap, looking at the ink there. I didn't ask about it right away. I waited until we knew each other better, which took about a year, because she was not a person who rushed into trust. That sounds right, I said, and then wished I had not said it, because Nora looked at me with a sharpening attention that I was not ready for. You recognize that about her, Nora said. It was not a question. I did not answer it directly. What did she tell you when you finally asked? She said it was the most important thing she owned. Nora's voice dropped slightly, not from sadness exactly, but from the weight of a memory that had never become ordinary, no matter how many times she had turned it over. She said somebody made it for her, so she would never forget where she belonged. That was the exact phrase, where she belonged. She looked at me steadily. And then she held my hand, which she had never done before, and she said something I have thought about almost every day since. I waited. I was good at waiting. 10 years of practice. She said, if you ever meet the man who has the other half of this, tell him I think about him every single morning when I wake up, and every night before I close my eyes. Tell him I never stopped. Nora's voice did not waver, but I could see the effort it cost her to keep it level. I didn't know what she meant. I didn't know there was another half. I thought she was being poetic the way people get sometimes when they've been alone a long time, and they finally trust someone enough to be honest. The October air moved through the trees above us, and a handful of leaves came down spinning slowly. Every morning when I wake up, every night before I close my eyes. 10 years. She had been alive for 10 years alone in a room in Knoxville, Tennessee, waking up and thinking about me, closing her eyes and thinking about me. And I had been here in Pasadena, putting flowers on a grave that held nobody I loved. My throat closed in the way it does when the body decides that words are no longer the appropriate response to what is happening, but has not yet worked out what the appropriate response actually is. I sat with that for a moment. I let it be what it was. What was she like? I asked when I could speak again. In 4 years, what was she like? Nora almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. She was the smartest person in any room she was ever in, Nora said. And she was kind about it, which is rarer than the smart part. She remembered everything, every staff member's birthday, every other resident's family situation, what the weather had been doing the same week the previous year. She read everything she could get her hands on. She did the crossword every morning in pen. Nora paused. She laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, every single time. My chest cracked open so quietly that I do not think Nora heard it. That was Maggie. That had always been Maggie. I need to ask you something, I said, and I need you to answer me honestly, even if you think the answer is going to be difficult. Nora looked at me without flinching. All right. Is she still in Tennessee? Nora did not answer right away. She reached into the front pocket of her jacket and took out her phone. She unlocked it, navigated to something, and then held the screen toward me with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who has decided to hand you something fragile and wants to make sure you are ready to hold it. I want you to look at this first, she said, before I answer your question. I took the phone. The photograph was taken indoors in a room I recognized as a nursing home room, without being told the particular quality of the light, the adjustable bed in the background, the curtain half drawn across a window that looked out onto a parking lot. The woman in the photograph was sitting in a chair beside the window. She was turned slightly toward the camera, not posing the way people look when someone has said their name, and they have glanced up before they had time to arrange themselves. Her hair was white, not the gray white of someone letting age come in, gradually but fully white the way hair goes when something happens to a person that the body records permanently. Her face had the lines of a woman in her early 70s, deeper at the corners of her eyes, softer along her jaw. Her left wrist rested on the arm of the chair, and in the light coming through the window, I could see the tattoo clearly, the compass, the branch, the bird. I looked at her face. My hands started shaking before my mind had finished the sentence it was trying to form. I had last seen that face on a Tuesday morning in October of 2014. She had been standing at the kitchen counter in a blue robe making coffee, and I had been running late for a site visit in Glendale, and I had kissed her on the top of her head as I passed, and she had said, without turning around, "You forgot your phone charger, it's on the nightstand," and I had gone back for it, and when I came back through the kitchen, she was already on her way upstairs, and I called out, "I love you," and she called back, "I know, drive safe," and I walked out the front door and got in my truck and drove to Glendale. That was the last time I saw her face. The face in the photograph was the same face. 10 years older, 10 years quieter around the eyes, in the way that happens to people who have spent a long time being careful about what they let themselves feel in public. But the architecture of it, the specific distance between her eyes, the way her mouth sat at rest, the angle of her chin, that was not something 10 years could change. "That is my wife," I said. My voice did not shake, and I was faintly amazed by this. "Her name in the file is Eleanor Marsh," Nora said, and her voice was very gentle, the voice she probably used at bedsides, the voice that knew how to carry hard information without dropping it. "But you're the second person to look at that photograph and tell me that isn't her real name." "Who was the first?" "Me," Nora said. "About 18 months after I started. I looked at her one afternoon and I thought this woman did not walk into this world as Eleanor Marsh. Nobody did. That name fits her the way a coat fits a person it wasn't made for. Functional, but wrong." I handed the phone back to her because I could not keep looking at the photograph and maintain any useful level of functioning. I pressed both palms flat against my thighs the way I do in difficult meetings when I need to anchor myself to something solid. Maggie. She had been sitting in a chair beside a window in Knoxville, Tennessee, watching a parking lot, doing the crossword in pen, laughing at her own jokes before she finished them, thinking about me every morning and every night while I drove past the flower shop on Lake Avenue and bought roses to put on a grave that was holding someone else's bones. "You said the emergency contact number stopped working in 2015. I said. My voice had taken on the flatness that comes when emotion has exceeded the capacity of expression and the body defaults to functional. "Do you know who filed it originally?" "It was in the intake paperwork," Nora said. "A number registered to a business line. The business dissolved in 2015. She paused. "I looked it up once. The company was a property management LLC registered in Delaware. Single member. I couldn't find who owned it." A Delaware LLC. Single member, untraceable, without a subpoena. That was not the work of someone improvising. That was the work of someone who had thought carefully about what threads could be pulled and had trimmed them in advance. My son had a law degree from Michigan and had spent 20 years watching me run a construction company. He had been learning since he was 12 years old how entities were structured, how paper trails were made and unmade. I had taught him that, in the belief that knowledge was something you gave to the people you loved. I had taught him very well. "Nora," I said her name for the first time, and she looked at me directly the way people do when they hear their name said, with weight behind it. "I need to ask you again. Is she still in Tennessee?" Nora put her phone back in her pocket. She looked at June and Sam on the grass, her daughter now sitting cross-legged, examining something she had found her son standing beside her, in the patient posture of a child, waiting for the next thing to happen. Then she looked back at me, and what was on her face was not hesitation. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a secret for long enough that setting it down requires a deliberate act of will. "No," she said. "She isn't in Tennessee." She took a breath that she let out slowly. "When I was let go from Cedarwood, I couldn't leave her there. I didn't know who would look after her. I didn't know if the people who had put her there would come back now that I wasn't watching. She held my gaze without blinking. So I didn't leave her there. I stared at her. I brought her home with me, Nora said, to California. I heard the words. I understood them individually. I understood them in sequence. And then I sat there on that bench in Pasadena on a Saturday morning in October, and my mind simply refused for a span of several seconds to assemble them into the thing they actually meant. She brought her home, to California. Say that again, I said. Nora did not look away from me. When Cedarwood let me go, I went back to say goodbye to her. That's all I intended to do. Walk in, say goodbye, walk out. Her hands tightened briefly in her lap. But when I got to her room, she was sitting on the edge of her bed with her coat on. Her coat and her shoes, like she'd been waiting. Nora's voice did not waver, but something behind it did. She looked at me, and she said, I heard them tell you not to come back. I've been waiting to see if you'd come anyway. And I said, yes, I came anyway, and she said, then let's go. I pressed my hand flat against my knee and concentrated on that point of pressure, the solid reality of bone and fabric, because I needed something in that moment that was not going to shift underneath me. The facility couldn't stop her, Nora continued. That's important to understand. Eleanor, your wife, was never declared legally incompetent. That's a formal legal process in Tennessee. It requires a court proceeding and a medical evaluation and a judge's order. Nobody had done that. She was a voluntary resident, which under Tennessee law means she retained the right to discharge herself at any time by signing a form. She was fully alert, fully oriented, fully capable of making her own decisions. Nora met my eyes steadily. So, she signed the discharge paperwork herself in front of 2 staff witnesses on a Thursday morning in March of 2020. I was waiting in the parking lot. She walked out through the front door under her own power and got into my car. I thought about Maggie walking out the front door of a nursing home in Knoxville, Tennessee, in her coat and her shoes, having decided in whatever way Maggie decided things quietly, completely, without drama, that it was time to leave. She had always been like that. When Maggie made up her mind, there was no transitional period between deciding and doing. She's been with you since 2020, I said. 4 years, Nora said. She has the back bedroom. She helps with the kids when I'm on a night shift. June calls her Grandma Ellie, which started as a joke and then just became what it was. She paused. She taught Sam to play chess. He beats me now, and he's insufferably proud of it. Something that was almost a laugh moved through my chest and died before it reached my face because there was no room for it yet among everything else that was happening in there. Maggie teaching a 7-year-old boy to play chess. Of course she had. She had taught me to play chess in the first year of our marriage on a board we bought at a garage sale in Silver Lake. And she had beaten me consistently for 6 years until I finally understood that she had been letting me win the first 4. Why didn't she contact me? My voice came out rougher than I intended. 4 years in California. She knew I was here. She had to know. She did know, Nora said, and her voice was very careful now. The way people are careful when they are about to hand you something that is going to hurt, and they want to cause the minimum necessary damage. She knew exactly where you were. She asked me once to drive past your house. We sat outside for about 10 minutes, and then she asked me to take her home. She held my gaze. She wanted to contact you more than she wanted most things, I think. But she was afraid. Afraid of what? Of what would happen to you if she did. Nora leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees, her voice dropping. She told me once, just once, and she never elaborated, that the person who had arranged her situation had made it very clear what the consequences would be if she tried to reach out, that you would be the one to bear those consequences, not her. She held my gaze. She chose silence over your safety being at risk, for 10 years and then for 4 more. She chose it every single day. The leaves came down around us. Somewhere behind me, Sam called out to June about something, and June called back, and the ordinary machinery of a Saturday in the park continued without interruption, because the world does not stop for the moments that stop you. 14 years. She had chosen me over herself, over her freedom, over every ordinary thing she had a right to. And she had done it so quietly that I had spent 10 years believing she was in the ground. Where is she right now? I asked. Exactly. 7 minutes from here, Nora said. She's at my house. Saturday mornings she reads and has tea and listens to the radio. She'll be in the kitchen. She paused. She doesn't know I came to this park today. I come here every Saturday with the kids because a doctor told me once that outdoor unstructured time is the best thing for children under 10, and I took that seriously. Her mouth moved towards something that was not quite a smile. I had no idea you existed until about 20 minutes ago. I stood up, my legs held. I was grateful for that, because I was not at all certain they would. Will you take me to her? I asked. Nora looked at me for a long moment. Then she stood up too, and turned toward the grass where her children were playing, and called out in the clear, carrying voice of a mother who has perfected the frequency that cuts through any level of ambient noise. June, Sam, we're leaving, come on. June protested on principle. Sam was already walking toward us. 7 minutes is not a long time. I have driven longer than 7 minutes to get coffee. I have sat in longer meetings without checking my watch. I have spent entire evenings in the particular suspended state of grief where time stops having reliable dimensions and an hour can pass in what feels like 10 minutes, or 10 minutes can stretch into something that has no name. But those 7 minutes from the park to Nora's house were the longest I have experienced in 72 years of living. I sat in the passenger seat of Nora's car, and I watched Pasadena move past the window, the jacaranda trees that had already dropped their flowers for the season, the coffee shops and dry cleaners, and the Saturday morning foot traffic of a neighborhood going about its ordinary business, and I kept my hands flat on my thighs, and I breathed the way you breathe when you are trying to keep your body from getting ahead of your mind. June and Sam were in the back seat. June asked 3 questions about where they were going. Nora answered each one with the same 2 words, home baby. And June eventually accepted this as sufficient information and went back to looking out her window. Sam said nothing. He watched me once in the side mirror with those careful dark eyes, and then looked away as if he had seen what he needed to see. Nora turned onto a street lined with older houses, craftsman style, the kind of neighborhood that had been working class once and was now expensive without having changed much physically. She pulled into a driveway beside a house with a front porch and 2 large planters that needed watering, and a welcome mat that said something I did not read because we were already getting out of the car. "Let me go in first," Nora said. It was not a question. I nodded. She went up the porch steps and unlocked the front door and pushed it open and went inside, and I stood at the bottom of the porch steps with June on my left and Sam on my right, both of them looking up at me in the way children look at adults when something important is happening, and the adults have not yet explained what it is. "Do you know our Grandma Ellie?" June asked. I looked down at her. "I think so," I said. "I haven't seen her in a long time." June considered this. "She'll be happy," she said with the absolute confidence of a child stating a fact. "She gets sad sometimes on Saturdays. She thinks we don't notice, but we notice." Sam nodded to confirm this as a verified observation. My throat did the thing again, the closing thing, and I looked up at the front door and concentrated on breathing. Nora appeared in the doorway. She looked at me and gave a small nod, one of those nods that carries more freight than the gesture has any right to carry, and stepped back to let me come up. I went up the porch steps. The house smelled like coffee and something baking, and the particular warm smell of a home that has people in it, which sounds like a simple thing to say, but is not simple at all when you have lived for 10 years in a house that smells like neither of those things. The hallway was narrow photographs on one wall. June and Sam at various ages, Nora at what looked like a graduation, a snapshot of an older woman and 2 small children at a beach that I did not let myself look at too closely. Nora said, from somewhere to my left, "Ellie, I brought someone home, someone who needs to see you." A pause, then the sound of a chair moving back from a table, then footsteps on hardwood floor, slow and deliberate, the steps of someone who moves carefully. Not from frailty, but from habit, from 10 years of being careful about everything. She came through the kitchen doorway. She was wearing a pale blue cardigan over a white shirt, and her white hair was pulled back, and she had her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the way she had always pushed them when she was not actually reading, but might need to at any moment. She was thinner than I remembered. Her face carried the years differently than I had imagined it in the dark moments when I had let myself imagine it, which I had not done often because it cost too much. She saw Nora first. Then her eyes moved to me. She stopped walking. Her hand came up and pressed flat against the doorframe beside her, not for balance, but the way you reach for something solid when the ground has changed under you without warning. Her reading glasses fell forward off her forehead, and she caught them automatically, her fingers closing around them without her eyes moving from my face. "Walter," she said. Just that. Just my name in her voice, which I had last heard, calling back to me across a kitchen 14 years ago, which I had replayed in my memory so many times in the years since that I had started to doubt whether I was remembering it accurately or constructing it from need. But there it was, real and present and exactly as I remembered, and completely different from anything memory had managed to preserve. I could not speak. For the first time in 72 years, I had absolutely nothing to say, and no mechanism to produce it even if I had. I stepped toward her. She stepped toward me. We met in the middle of that small living room, between the kitchen doorway and the hallway, on a patch of hardwood floor, with afternoon light coming in sideways through the front windows. And I put my arms around her, and she put her arms around me, and she made a sound that I will not try to describe, because there is no word for it, not in English, not in any language. I know a sound that is what 14 years of held silence sounds like when it finally comes out all at once. I held on. She held on. June and Sam stood in the hallway, watching with wide eyes and the particular stillness of children who have understood, without being told, that this is not a moment for questions or commentary. Nora turned away toward the kitchen, and I was grateful for that, and I heard her put the kettle on. We sat at Nora's kitchen table. It was a small table, the kind that seats four if nobody minds being close, with a wooden surface worn smooth at the edges from years of use, and a small ceramic vase in the center holding 3 dried flowers that had gone past their color, but been kept anyway. Nora set 2 mugs of tea between us, and then took June and Sam out to the backyard, with a firmness that suggested this was not negotiable, and the back door closed, and it was just the 2 of us and the sound of the kettle cooling on the stove and the distant noise of the children outside. Maggie wrapped both hands around her mug. Her hands were the same hands. Thinner at the knuckles, the skin more translucent the way skin goes, after 70, but the same shape, the same way of holding a warm cup with both palms, as if she were cold even when she was not. I watched her do that, and something in me that had been clenched for 10 years released a fraction of the way. "You look the same," she said. "I look 72, I said. "You've always looked 72. The corner of her mouth moved. "Even when you were 45, you had that face." I had forgotten that. The specific way she had of saying things that were funny and true at the same time, landing them so quietly that you sometimes did not realize you were smiling until you were already doing it. I had forgotten it the way you forget the particular quality of light in a place you loved, not all at once but gradually, until one day you can no longer recall it precisely, and the forgetting itself becomes a kind of loss layered on top of the original one. "Tell me," I said, "from the beginning, tell me everything." She looked down at her tea, then she looked up at me, and I saw in her face the thing I had not seen clearly in the park or in the hallway or in the first minutes of holding her. I saw the particular steadiness of a person who has had a very long time to decide what they are going to say when this moment finally comes and has made their peace with saying it. "It was a Tuesday," she said. "October 14th, 2014. I was driving back from Barbara's, you remember Barbara, my book club friend in Arcadia, and I was on the 3210 just past the Michelinda exit." She paused. "A black SUV came up behind me very fast, then another one alongside me. They didn't hit me. They just positioned. One on my left, one behind. I couldn't change lanes. I couldn't slow down. The one behind me got close enough that I could see the driver's face in my rearview mirror." She took a breath. "He was not looking at me the way someone looks at you when they've made a driving mistake. He was looking at me the way someone looks at you when they are doing exactly what they intended to do." My jaw tightened. I kept my hands around my mug and I did not move. "They guided me to an exit I didn't choose," she said. "There was a van waiting, 2 men who said almost nothing. They were professional about it in the way that made it clear they had done something like this before." She looked at me steadily. "I was not hurt. I want you to know that. They were very deliberate about not hurting me." "Maggie, let me finish," she said not unkindly. "I've been going over this in my head for 10 years, and I need to say it in order, or I'll lose the thread." She pressed her lips together briefly. "They drove for a long time. I slept at some point, which I think means they gave me something, though I don't know when or how. When I woke up, I was in a room I had never seen, and a woman I had never met was telling me my name was Eleanor Marsh." "A woman," I said. "What did she look like?" 50 maybe. dark hair very professional. She sat down across from me at a table, and she explained the situation the way an attorney explains a contract methodically without visible emotion. Maggie's eyes met mine. She told me that an arrangement had been made for my care and comfort, that I had a new name and a new history, that my family had been informed I had passed away in an accident, and that as long as I cooperated with the arrangement, the people I loved would not be harmed. Sandra Merritt, I did not say the name yet. I filed it in the part of my mind that had been a construction company president for 40 years and knew how to hold information in place until the right moment. And you believed her, I said. I believed the part about people being harmed. Maggie set her mug down and looked at her hands on the table. Because she said your name, specifically. She said Walter Grayson. She said the address of our house. She said the route you drove to the office every morning. Her voice did not break. It thinned slightly the way a board thins when you've sanded it down to something true and clean. When someone tells you that kind of detail, you understand that they are not speaking hypothetically. 3 weeks before this happened, I said slowly, I told the board we were going to finalize the charitable trust, moving 40% of your 51% controlling shares into a permanent foundation. In your name. Maggie nodded. She had known. Of course she had known. She had probably worked it out within the first weeks in that room in Tennessee, lying in the dark the way you lie in the dark when you have nothing to do but think. He was going to lose control of the company, she said. Yes, I said. We sat with that. Outside, Sam shouted something triumphant, and June shouted back that it didn't count. The ordinary Saturday of 2 children in a backyard, the most ordinary thing in the world. I want to ask you something, I said, and I need you to answer me honestly even if the answer is difficult. Maggie looked at me. Walter, after everything, ask. Were you ever... I stopped, rebuilt the sentence. In 14 years, were you ever not thinking about coming back? She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her grip was firm, warm, real in the way that things are real when you have doubted their reality for long enough that touching them feels like the resolution of an argument you were losing. Never, she said, not for one day. Her hand stayed on mine for a long moment. Then she drew it back and wrapped it around her mug again, and I understood that the tenderness had its limit for now. Not because she wanted it to end, but because there was still ground. We had to cover, and she knew the way she had always known that some things had to be walked through before you could rest. He came once, I said, to Tennessee. Maggie looked up at me sharply, and I saw the question in her face, how did I know that? And I shook my head. I don't know it, I said. I'm saying it because it's the kind of thing he would do, because Elliot does not leave arrangements incomplete. He would have needed to close the loop. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, and something in her face settled the way a door settles when it finally closes all the way. 8 years ago, she said. 2016, spring. I think the dogwoods were out. I remember that because I could see them from my window, and I had been watching them come in for 2 weeks. She paused. He walked in without calling ahead. The staff didn't stop him because he was listed in my intake file as an approved visitor under an assumed name. I found that out afterward from Nora. At the time, I just looked up and he was standing in my doorway. What did he say? Nothing at first. He looked at the room the way he used to look at job sites when he was learning the business from you, taking inventory, assessing. Her jaw tightened fractionally. Then he sat down and he opened his briefcase and he put a document on the table between us. What kind of document? A relinquishment, she said. Complete and permanent surrender of all property rights, inheritance rights, and claims against the estate of Walter Grayson and the assets of Grayson Construction. Every account we had held jointly, the house, the investment portfolio, the stake in the company that you had put in my name when we incorporated the charitable foundation. She looked at her hands. Every single thing, my chest tightened with a slow, cold pressure that was different from grief and different from anger. Something older and more fundamental, the particular feeling of a man who has understood fully and without remaining doubt that the person he raised did something that cannot be undone. And he asked you to sign it, I said. He didn't ask. Her voice was even. She had had 8 years to make it even about this specific thing. He put his pen on top of the document and he said, and I am giving you his exact words because I have said them to myself too many times to misremember them. He said, sign this, Mom, or I can't guarantee what happens to Dad. She looked at me directly. He called me Mom. He called you Dad. And then he told me he could not guarantee your safety. In the same sentence, without his voice changing. The morning light through Nora's kitchen window had shifted while we talked. It was fuller now, coming in at a lower angle, laying a stripe of gold across the worn surface of the table between us. "Did you sign it?" I asked, though I already knew. "I picked up his pen," Maggie said, "and my hand shook so badly that the first attempt wasn't legible, and he had to tell me to try again." She looked at her right hand as if she were remembering the feeling of it. I signed it, and he took the document and put it back in his briefcase and stood up and snapped the briefcase closed and walked to the door. Did he look back? A long pause. "No," she said. "He did not look back." I sat with that. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator's hum and the sound of June and Sam in the yard, their voices carrying the way children's voices carry on. Quiet mornings, clear and specific and entirely unconcerned with anything that was happening inside this house. "I need to tell you something about that document," I said. "Something that might matter to you." Maggie raised her eyes. In the United States, a contract or legal document signed under duress has no binding force, I said. Duress means coercion, being threatened or compelled to sign against your will. What Elliot did in that room was not negotiation. It was coercion with an explicit threat attached. I kept my voice measured, the way Calvin had always told me to keep it in difficult conversations. Slow it down, make each word land separately. Any competent attorney can have that document declared void. The signature is meaningless. Legally, you never signed it. Maggie stared at me. "You haven't lost anything," I said. "Not on paper, not legally." "Walter." Her voice caught for the first time since we had sat down. She pressed her lips together and breathed through it. "I haven't thought about the money. I haven't thought about any of it in years." "I know," I said. "I'm not telling you for the money. I'm telling you because I need you to know that he didn't win. Whatever he thought he took from you, he didn't take it. It was never legally his to take." She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes were bright in the way eyes get when the body is managing something large and doing its best to manage it without making a scene. "You always did that," she said finally. "Did what? Found the one true thing in a bad situation and handed it to me." She exhaled slowly. "You've been doing that for 40 years. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, the way she had covered mine 10 minutes before. Outside, Sam shouted that he had found something, and June shouted back that she found it first, and Nora's voice cut through both of theirs, with the practiced clarity of a woman who has been moderating this particular dispute for 7 years. "There's more," I said. "About how all of this was arranged, about who else was involved." I watched her face. "Are you ready for that?" Maggie straightened in her chair. Her chin came up the way it always did when she was preparing for something difficult, not bracing against it, but leaning toward it, meeting it directly. "Tell me," she said. I told her about Nora, not the parts she already knew, the 4 years at Cedarwood, the Thursday evenings, when Nora would stay past her shift to sit with her, the way Nora had learned without being told that she preferred her tea without sugar, and her crossword without interruption. Those parts Maggie knew better than I did. I told her the parts that had happened this morning in the park, before any of us understood what we were standing in the middle of. I told her about June and Sam running ahead on the path, about a small hand pointing at my wrist, about the 8 words that had stopped the world. Maggie listened with her hands around her mug and her eyes on my face, and when I got to the part about June saying, "You have the same tattoo as our mom," something happened in Maggie's expression that I had no name for, something that moved through her face the way weather moves across open water, visible and real and gone before you could describe it precisely. "She never told me she did that," Maggie said. "The tattoo, I showed it to her once when she asked about it. She photographed it. I didn't know she had it put on herself." She paused. She never said a word. "She didn't want to make it about her," I said. "I think that's the kind of person she is." Maggie looked toward the backyard window where we could see Nora pushing Sam on a tire swing, while June provided critical commentary from the fence. Her expression was the expression of a woman who had been loved quietly and unexpectedly for 4 years and had not found the right words for it yet. "There's more," I said, "about why she left Cedarwood, about what happened before she brought you home." I told her about the phone call, the voice Nora had never identified. The offer $80,000 deposited into her account if she resigned that week and never mentioned Eleanor Marsh to anyone. The way Nora had ended the call and walked directly to her supervisor's office and reported it. The way she had been let go 7 days later under the language of organizational restructuring, which is what institutions say when they want someone gone and do not want to explain why. She recorded it, I said. The call, she had a feeling, and she pressed record before she answered, and she has kept the file for 4 years without deleting it. Maggie set her mug down carefully. That girl, she said very quietly in the tone of someone who has just had a long-held belief confirmed. There's a legal issue with it, I said. California has what's called a two-party consent law under Penal Code 632. Recording a phone conversation without notifying the other party is not admissible as direct evidence in a California court. But Calvin, my attorney, you'll meet him, you'll like him. Calvin told me the recording doesn't need to be courtroom evidence to be useful. It tells us where to look. It gives us the shape of the thing. The admissible evidence we build from following that shape. Maggie nodded slowly, the nod of a woman who had been married to a man who built things for 40 years and understood the difference between a foundation and the structure that went up on top of it. Calvin, she said. Calvin Okafor. You remember him? You hired him in 2009. You said he was the sharpest attorney in Los Angeles and you were going to steal him before anyone else did. A ghost of something crossed her face. You were right, as I recall. He's been with the company 15 years, I said. He's the reason I had someone to call this afternoon when I understood what I was dealing with. I had called Calvin from the car sitting outside Nora's house for the 3 minutes it took Nora to get Maggie settled and come to the door to wave me in. I had given him the summary in the way we had always communicated in difficult situations. Facts first, context, second ask at the end. He had listened without interrupting, which was Calvin's particular professional courtesy and also his tell for when he was thinking very hard. Pull everything, I had told him. Every share transfer, every board resolution, every document that moved through Grayson Construction in the last 10 years that has Maggie's name or signature on it, every single one. Walter Calvin had said, and his voice had carried the specific weight it carried when he was about to say something he needed me to hear clearly. If what you're describing is accurate and I'm not doubting you, I'm being precise, then what we're looking at is not a civil matter. This is criminal, multiple felonies, potentially federal if the financial transactions cross state lines, which they almost certainly did. I know, I had said. Then I need you to understand something before we start pulling documents. Once we start, we don't stop. There is no version of this where we pull one thread and then decide it's enough. We pull it all the way. I know that too, I had said. I told Maggie all of this now at the kitchen table with the morning getting older around us and the tea going cold in the mugs we had stopped drinking. She listened to every word. She asked 2 questions, one about the timeline of the share transfers, one about whether Calvin had any connection to the district attorney's office, both of which were exactly the questions a person asks when they have been running a version of this scenario in their head for 10 years and already know most of the architecture of it. You've thought about this, I said, how this would go. If it ever went. I had a great deal of time to think, she said, without irony and without bitterness, which was harder to hear than either would have been. Outside, June had apparently resolved her differences with the tire swing, and was now involved in something that required her to narrate loudly while Sam provided sound effects. Nora's voice floated in through the window, tolerant and tired and fond in the way of a person who has made peace with the particular volume level at which her life operates. Maggie, I said. I need to ask you something before Calvin calls back. She looked at me steadily. The woman who came to you in Tennessee, the one who explained the arrangement. I held her gaze. Dark hair, professional mid-50s now. Would you recognize her if you saw a photograph? Maggie did not hesitate. I would recognize her, she said, if I saw her across a parking lot in the dark. Calvin called back 3 days later. In those 3 days, I did things I had not done in 10 years. On Monday morning, I drove Maggie to the house, our house, the one we had bought in San Marino, in 1993, for reasons that had seemed practical at the time, and had turned out to be about something larger than practicality. The neighborhood. The particular quality of the light in the afternoons. The garden that the previous owners had started, and that Maggie had spent the first 5 years of our time there quietly transforming into something that was entirely hers. She had redesigned the kitchen in 2008 because the original layout, she said, did not understand how a kitchen was supposed to work, and she had been correct about that. I had kept the garden alive in the years since watering, pruning back what needed pruning, replacing what died out of a stubbornness I had never examined too closely, because examining it would have required me to admit that I was keeping it alive for someone I had spent 10 years trying to accept was gone. She walked through the house the way you walk through a place you have loved for a long time, after a long absence, not rushing, not performing, simply moving from room to room and touching things briefly as she went. The edge of the kitchen counter, the back of the chair at the head of the table that had always been hers, the door frame of the room that used to be her study, where she had kept her books in the organized system that only she fully understood, and which I had not disturbed in 10 years, because disturbing it had felt like a kind of erasure I was not prepared to make. She touched each thing the way you touch something, to confirm it is still real, not possessively, confirmingly. She stood in the garden for 20 minutes without saying anything. I stood beside her and did not say anything either, because some things do not need commentary. The November garden was past its best season. The roses cut back, the beds, cleared the whole thing, holding itself in the particular patient stillness of something that has learned to wait. I watched her look at it, and I thought she has been waiting too, longer than the garden, more patiently than I managed. On Tuesday, she called Nora. They talked for an hour. I was in the study going through some papers that needed attention, and I heard Maggie laugh twice from the other room. The full laugh, the one that starts in the chest and moves up, the one that used her whole body, the one I had cataloged in the first years after she was gone as the thing I missed most, specifically, more than her voice in general, more than her presence at the table. This particular laugh above everything else, because you cannot approximate it. You cannot reconstruct it from memory. With any accuracy, you can only wait for it and then stand very still when you hear it again, so you do not miss a single second of it. I stopped what I was doing both times. I stood still. I let it be what it was. Calvin called on Thursday afternoon. I was in the study. Maggie was in the garden, doing what she had always done with the late-season beds, deadheading the last of the roses, with the focused efficiency of someone who finds physical work a form of thinking, which she always had. I watched her through the window for a moment before I picked up the phone. The afternoon light was coming in sideways the way it comes in November, and it caught the white of her hair and the color of her cardigan and the particular deliberate movement of her hands. And for a moment I was so precisely aware of being alive and having her here that the awareness itself was almost too large to hold. Then the phone rang and I answered it. "Tell me," I said. Calvin had been through every document that had moved through Grayson Construction in the last decade, with Maggie's name attached to it. He had found 3. A charitable trust amendment from 2013, clean, both of us had signed it in person, the notarization verified. A property transfer from 9 months after the accident, and a share transfer document from 2014, executed 19 days after the date of Maggie's reported death. 51% of Maggie's voting shares, Calvin said, transferred in full to Elliot Grayson. His voice carried the particular flatness he used when he needed me to receive information, rather than react to it. Signed, dated, and notarized. The signature is your wife's name. The notary seal belongs to a licensed California notary named Thomas Alcott. I already knew what was coming, in the way you know things when the evidence has been building for days and your mind has been running ahead of what you are willing to say out loud. But knowing something is coming does not prepare you for the moment it arrives. The signature, I said, is forged. Calvin did not soften it. He never softened the things that needed to be said directly. I sent the document to a forensic document examiner yesterday morning. She turned it around in 18 hours. The pen pressure is inconsistent with Maggie's authenticated signature on the 2013 document. The letter formation diverges in 7 specific places, and there are 3 characteristics of Maggie's genuine signature, particular to her, developed over decades, that the forger did not replicate. Could not have replicated without extended practice with exemplar documents that she did not have access to. A pause. She is prepared to testify to this in any court in the state, federal or otherwise. I sat down in my desk chair. The leather made the familiar sound it has made for 15 years. The sound of a chair that has been sat in for every difficult phone call and every good one, and for a moment, the ordinariness of the sound against the weight of what I was hearing produced a contrast so sharp it was almost physical, like touching something cold without expecting it. "The notary," I said. "Thomas Alcott, licensed California notary, active from 1998 to 2015. Graduated University of Michigan law class of 1994. Calvin stopped, waited. He knew I would hear what that meant without being told. "Elliot's class," I said. "Same class, same concentration in corporate law. I found their yearbook from the university archive. They appear together in 3 organization photographs." Another pause. Alcott retired from notary practice in February of 2015 and relocated to Costa Rica. His California license lapsed the following month, 6 weeks after he notarized the forged signature on the share transfer document. I thought about Costa Rica, the deliberateness of it. A country with extradition relations with the United States, but a justice system that moves slowly enough to buy years of distance. That choice did not happen in a moment of panic. It happened in the same cold, patient season of calculation that had produced everything else. The accident that was not an accident. The name that was not a name. The woman in a chair beside a window in Tennessee, watching a parking lot and doing the crossword in pen because it was the one thing she could control. My son had planned this the way I had taught him to plan things, thoroughly, from every angle, with attention to what could go wrong and provisions made in advance for each contingency. I had taught him well. "There's more," Calvin said. "I know there is," I said. "Go ahead." I traced the financial records connected to Alcott's professional account in the period surrounding the 2014 documents. 2 payments, one in September, one in November of that year, both originating from the same source. A Delaware limited liability company, single member, that dissolved in 2016. He stopped again, the specific stop of a man who understands the weight of what he is about to say. The registered agent for that LLC was Sandra Merritt. The name settled over the phone call the way certain things settle, not loudly, but with a finality that changed the shape of everything around it. Sandra Merritt. 14 years with Grayson Construction. Hired by Elliot in 2015, which I now understood meant she had been placed, not hired, brought in as the second piece of an arrangement whose first piece was already in Tennessee, already answering to a name that was not her own. Sandra, who had sat across from me in the boardroom for over a decade, who had given competent professional advice on 100 decisions, who I had thanked more than once for her steady leadership, who I had trusted because Elliot had brought her in, and I had trusted Elliot, and that trust had been the door through which all of it had walked. "She's still the CEO, I said. "For now," Calvin said. Then he asked me whether I was prepared for what came next. What going to the FBI instead of the local district attorney would mean for the company, for the people who depended on it, for the 412 employees who had nothing to do with any of this, and whose lives would be affected by the investigation regardless. I looked out the window at the garden. Maggie had set down the pruning shears and was pulling off her garden gloves finger by finger, the way she had always done it, the left glove first, then the right, tucking them together before setting them on the edge of the raised bed. A habit of 30 years. As natural and unremarkable as breathing. I thought about 412 people. I thought about what the company had been before Elliot got to it and what it would be after this. "The company was built before him," I said. "It'll stand after." "All right," Calvin said. "Then I need you in my office tomorrow, you and Maggie both, and I need the phone number of the woman with the recording." I set the phone down and walked out to the garden. The November air was cool and clear and smelled of cut stems and turned soil. Maggie looked up when she heard the door. "Calvin," she said. "Tomorrow," I said. "His office, both of us." She nodded, one of those nods that says more than the gesture has any right to contain. She looked at me with the level, clear-eyed steadiness of a woman who had been waiting for tomorrow for 10 years and had not let the waiting make her smaller. "Good," she said. "Let's finish it." Calvin's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Wilshire Boulevard that had been there since the 70s and showed it in the good way, solid, unhurried, built for duration rather than impression. I had been coming to this office for 15 years. I knew the receptionist's name, and the view from the window, and the particular way the afternoon light came through the west-facing glass and made everything look slightly more resolved than it actually was. I had never brought Maggie here before. She sat beside me in the chair I usually occupied, alone, her hands folded in her lap. wearing the gray blazer she had found in the back of her closet at the house on Monday, still there, still fit, as if some part of the house had been keeping things in trust. Nora sat to her left, slightly forward in her chair, a woman who had come prepared and wanted that to be evident. She had the recording on her phone and a printed timeline she had made herself at her kitchen table the night before, 2 pages dates and observations and names. The careful documentation of someone who had understood for 4 years that what she knew might matter someday. Calvin read Nora's timeline without speaking. He was a methodical reader. You could tell by the way his eyes moved line by line, no skimming. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Nora directly. "This is good work," he said. "I mean that as a professional assessment, not a compliment." Nora accepted this with a nod that said she understood the distinction. "The recording," Calvin said. "California Penal Code 632 prohibits recording a phone call without the consent of all parties. This means the recording itself cannot be entered as direct evidence in a California state court proceeding." He held up one hand before Nora could respond. "However, we are not pursuing this as a state matter. What we are building is a federal case because the financial fraud at the center of this crossed state lines, money moved from California to Tennessee to Costa Rica, which triggers federal jurisdiction under wire fraud statutes, specifically 18 United States Code, Section 1343. He let that settle for a moment. Under federal rules of evidence, the recording may be treated differently. More importantly, the recording gives us the investigative thread we need. The voice on that call is traceable. The number it originated from is traceable even if it was a burner, because call records don't disappear. They live in carrier databases, and federal investigators have the tools to pull them. He looked at Nora steadily. "You did the right thing keeping it. Do not delete it. Do not share it with anyone outside this room." Nora pulled out her phone and handed it to Calvin without hesitation. "I backed it up to 2 places," she said. 4 years ago, because I didn't trust one copy." Calvin took the phone and allowed himself a brief expression that was as close to impressed as I had ever seen him get. He walked us through what came next in the careful, unhurried way he had always explained complex processes, not dumbing it down, not performing expertise, just making sure every person in the room understood exactly what was going to happen and why. The referral to the FBI field office in Los Angeles, the formal interview process, the forensic accountants who would be assigned to go through Grayson Construction's financial records with the kind of attention that routine audits never applied. The likelihood that Elliott's assets would be frozen pending investigation once the preliminary findings were submitted. "How long?" I asked. "The investigation itself 6 to 12 months before charges are filed, assuming they find what I expect them to find, which I do expect." Calvin folded his hands on the desk. "Trial 18 months to 2 years after that. Federal cases move at the pace they move. I cannot make it faster. I can make sure every piece of evidence we hand them is airtight." "And Sandra Merritt," Maggie said. It was the first time she had spoken since we sat down, and both Calvin and Nora turned toward her. Her voice was even and clear. "She will know the investigation has started. What stops her from running the way Alcott ran?" Calvin looked at her with the focused attention he gave to questions that deserved it. "2 things," he said. "First, she doesn't know yet. We have not tipped our hand to anyone inside Grayson Construction, and we will not until the FBI is ready to move. Second, and this is the more important answer, Sandra Merritt has been holding a private insurance policy for 10 years. He opened the folder in front of him and slid a single page across the desk. "My investigator found this in the Delaware LLC records before the company dissolved. It's a contract between Elliott Grayson and Sandra Merritt, signed by both dated September of 2014. It details her role in the arrangement and the compensation she received for it." Maggie reached out and picked up the page. She read it without her expression changing, with the stillness of someone who has imagined a version of this document for a decade and is now simply confirming the details. "She kept a copy," Maggie said. "People who do things like this always keep a copy," Calvin said, "because the person who hired them is always the greater risk. Sandra Merritt has been sitting on this contract since the day she signed it because she knew that the moment Elliott decided she was a liability, she would need it." He leaned back in his chair. "When the FBI brings her in for questioning, and they will, she's the most accessible witness with direct operational knowledge. She is going to make a calculation. And the calculation is going to tell her that the contract in her bag is worth more than her loyalty to a man who never told her she was anything other than a tool. I looked at the page in Maggie's hands, a document signed in September of 2014, the same month Maggie had been put in a van and driven to Tennessee. "She'll talk," I said. It was not a question. "She'll talk," Calvin confirmed. "The only question is whether she talks to protect herself partially or entirely. My job is to make sure the FBI understands the difference between those two outcomes before they walk into that room with her." Maggie set the page down on Calvin's desk with a precision that was not anger, but was adjacent to it, the controlled placement of someone who has decided that emotion is not the right instrument for this particular moment. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Calvin said, "you go home, both of you. You do nothing that changes your ordinary routine. You do not contact Elliot. You do not contact anyone at Grayson Construction." He looked at each of us in turn. "You let me work." We drove home on the 110 freeway in the particular Friday afternoon traffic of Los Angeles, which is its own kind of patience-building exercise, and Maggie sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and watched the city move past the window, the way she had watched it when we first drove this freeway together 30 years ago, new to it and interested in everything. "You all right?" I asked. She turned from the window and looked at me. "I will be," she said. "Ask me again in about 2 years. Waiting is its own kind of work." I had learned that in the first years after Maggie disappeared, when waiting was all there was, and I had not yet understood that grief requires the same discipline as anything else worth doing. You show up for it. You do not rush it. You let it take the time it takes, and you trust that the other side of it exists, even when you cannot see it from where you are standing. I had gotten reasonably good at waiting in those years. I had not expected to need that particular skill again so soon and in such a different context. But there it was. Calvin had said 6 to 12 months. The FBI operated on its own calendar, responsive to the weight of evidence and the availability of resources and a dozen other variables that no one outside the process could fully anticipate. What I had not expected was how quickly, once the machinery started moving, it moved. 4 weeks after our meeting on Wilshire Boulevard, Calvin called on a Tuesday morning while I was in the garden with Maggie, both of us doing the kind of quiet outdoor work that requires just enough attention to keep the mind present without crowding out conversation. She was cutting back the late-season roses. I was pretending to read a construction trade journal and mostly watching her move through the garden with the focused ease of someone returning to a language they had never forgotten. "Sandra Merritt was contacted by the FBI yesterday," Calvin said. "Formally, her attorney called me this morning." I set the journal down on the garden table. Maggie looked up from the roses. "Her attorney called you," I said, "because Sandra Merritt's attorney is smart enough to know that the best outcome for his client requires him to understand what the government already has before he advises her on anything." Calvin's voice carried the particular quality it had when events were moving in the direction he had predicted, and he was being careful not to sound satisfied about it. He wanted to know the scope of what we'd submitted to the FBI. I told him I wasn't in a position to share that. He thanked me and hung up. A pause. He'll advise her to cooperate. He has no other rational move. "How long before she sits down with them?" "She already has," Calvin said. "Yesterday afternoon. The contact and the interview happened the same day, which tells you something about how prepared her attorney was. He had clearly been anticipating this for some time." Another pause, longer this time, the kind Calvin used when he was about to say something that required its own space. "Walter, she gave them everything." The garden was very quiet around me. A mockingbird somewhere in the neighbor's liquidambar tree was working through its repertoire, indifferent to everything happening below it. "Define everything," I said. "The storage facility in Glendale where Maggie's personal effects were held for 6 months before being disposed of. The specific date and time that Elliot called her and told her to drive to Tennessee and check a woman named Margaret, a woman using a false name, which Sandra understood meant a woman Elliot needed contained. The account number the payments came from. The cell phone number Elliot used to contact her that she was told to delete but did not delete." Calvin stopped. "She kept records, Walter. Detailed records, dates, times, instructions, payments. She kept them in a safety deposit box at a bank in Burbank that Elliot did not know about." I looked at Maggie across the garden. She had stopped cutting roses. She was watching my face with the focused stillness of a woman reading a situation from the outside of a phone call, filling in the shape of what she could not hear from what she could see. I put the call on speaker. "Calvin," I said. "Say that again, from the beginning." He did. And Maggie stood among the half-cut roses in the November garden and listened to the architecture of what had been done to her, being dismantled piece by piece in the measured professional voice of the sharpest attorney in Los Angeles. When Calvin finished, the garden was quiet again, except for the mockingbird. "The man who drove the car," Maggie said. Her voice was steady. "The one who forced me off the 210. "The FBI has his name," Calvin said through the speaker. "He's been located. I don't have more detail than that yet." "The proffer agreement." I said the formal term for the arrangement under which Sandra had agreed to cooperate. Under federal law, a proffer agreement, sometimes called a Queen for a Day agreement, allows a witness to provide information to investigators with a degree of protection. Statements made during the proffer session generally cannot be used directly against the witness, though the leads they generate can be followed. It was not immunity. It was the first step toward immunity, the part where both sides established whether full cooperation was worth offering in exchange for reduced charges. What did they give her? Preliminary proffer, Calvin said. Full immunity is on the table if her information checks out, which it will, because what she gave them is specific enough to verify within days, not weeks. Her attorney negotiated hard. He got her what he could. A pause. Elliot's attorney, by contrast, received a different kind of call from the FBI this morning. The kind where they tell you your client's window for voluntary cooperation has closed. Maggie pressed her hand flat against the garden table, fingers spread the way she steadied herself when she needed grounding without wanting it to show. I reached across and put my hand over hers. "When?" I asked Calvin. "The arrest," he said, "is at the discretion of the investigating agents. Based on what Sandra provided, they have sufficient probable cause. My understanding, and this is from a source I trust but cannot guarantee, is that it will not be a long wait." It was not. Elliot was arrested on a Thursday evening 3 weeks later, as he was leaving the Grayson construction offices in Burbank. I did not watch it happen. I found out from a neighbor who called to tell me she had seen it on the local news, and I thanked her and said I already knew, which was not true, and sat down in the kitchen chair where Maggie was already sitting, having seen the same news on the small television on the counter. We sat at the kitchen table together, in the house we had shared for 30 years, and the news channel moved on to other things. Because news always moves on, and the kitchen was warm, and the tea was hot, and outside the window, the November garden held its shapes in the dark. "It's done," Maggie said. "Not yet," I said. "But it's started." She reached across the table. Her hand covered mine. "Close enough," she said. "Before I reveal the shocking truth ahead, comment the word exposed down below, so I know you're still here, standing for justice. Also, please note the following events include some fictional elements added for dramatic effect. If this isn't the kind of content you're looking for, feel free to turn off the video right here. But if you choose to stay, what's coming next will not disappoint you. The night Elliot was arrested, I did not sleep. Not from shock. I had been moving toward this night for weeks, and the arrival of it was not a surprise. Not from guilt exactly, though guilt was somewhere in the room, with me sitting in the corner the way it sits when you have done the right thing and know it and still feel the weight of what the right thing cost. I lay in the dark in the bedroom of the house I had lived in for 30 years, and I listened to Maggie breathing beside me. The first time in 14 years I had heard that sound in that room, and I thought about my son. I thought about Elliot at 9 years old, sitting on an upturned crate at a job site in Alhambra, wearing a hard hat that was 3 sizes too large, watching the framing crew work with the focused intensity of a child who has decided he wants to understand everything about the thing in front of him. I thought about him at 22, the summer before law school, working a full labor schedule on one of our biggest commercial projects, because he said he wanted to know what it felt like from the ground up before he ever managed anyone from the top. I had been proud of that. I had told the site foreman about it. I had believed it meant something real about who my son was. I thought about the briefcase snapping shut in a room in Tennessee. At some point before dawn, Maggie said without preamble from her side of the bed, "You're not going to find the answer in the dark, Walter." "I know," I said. "You've been looking for it for 2 hours. I know that too." She reached across and found my hand in the dark and held it without saying anything further. And that was exactly right, and after a while, I slept. The months that followed had their own rhythm. Calvin had warned me that federal cases do not move the way television suggests they move. There are no dramatic reversals in a single afternoon, no climactic moments that resolve everything in an hour. There is discovery, which is the formal process by which both sides exchange the evidence they intend to present at trial. There are motions filed and argued and ruled upon, each one a small procedural battle in a larger war. There are delays, some tactical, some simply administrative, the inevitable friction of a complex system processing a complex case. Elliot's attorney, a man from a downtown firm, whose name I recognized from high-profile cases I had read about over the years, filed 7 pretrial motions. Calvin told me about each one as it was filed, and each one as it was denied, which all 7 were. The evidence was too substantial and too well documented to be successfully challenged on procedural grounds. Sandra's testimony, the forensic document analysis, the financial records, the proffer from Thomas Alcott, yes, Alcott, who had agreed to provide a video deposition from Costa Rica, rather than face the alternative of extradition proceedings that Calvin had quietly set in motion through contacts at the Department of Justice. Alcott appeared on a screen in a conference room in the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles on a Wednesday morning in March of 2025, a man in his late 50s, gray and thinner than his Michigan law school photographs, sitting in front of a plain wall in what appeared to be a lawyer's office in San Jose. He confirmed every document. He confirmed the dates, the payments, the instructions he had received. He had been in Costa Rica for 10 years, waiting for the version of this conversation that he had always known was coming, and when it came, he answered every question in the flat, exhausted voice of a person who has been holding something heavy for a very long time, and has finally been told he can set it down. Calvin called me after the Alcott deposition. "We're ready," he said. "The prosecution is ready. Trial is confirmed for December of 2025. A pause. "Walter, I want to prepare you for something." "Go ahead." Elliot's attorney is going to put forward a diminished capacity argument as part of the defense. The claim will be that Elliot acted under extreme psychological pressure related to his fear of losing the company his father built, a kind of inheritance anxiety that his attorney will dress up in clinical language and present as mitigation. Calvin's voice was careful. "It is not a strong argument. The evidence of premeditation is too extensive, but you will hear it, and it will be framed in ways that are designed to be painful for you, specifically." I sat with that for a moment. "I know my son planned this," I said. "I know he planned it over months, possibly years. No argument his attorney makes changes what I know." "I know you know that," Calvin said. "I'm telling you because knowing it and hearing it argued in a courtroom in front of a jury are 2 different experiences." He was right about that, as it turned out. The year between Elliot's arrest and the trial was not empty. Maggie came back to the company not in an operational role, not yet, but in the board meetings, the ones that mattered, the ones where the direction of Grayson Construction was decided by the people whose names were on the building. She sat at that table for the first time in 14 years, and the people who had known her before straightened up when she walked in, the involuntary straightening of people who have just realized that something they thought was lost has not been lost at all. Nora came to dinner on a Sunday in February. She brought June and Sam, who had been told enough by then to understand that the woman they called Grandma Ellie had a husband and a history that was larger than the back bedroom in their house. And they had processed this with the adaptability of children who have decided that more family is generally an improvement on less. Sam beat me at chess after dinner. He was insufferably proud of it. Maggie caught my eye across the table, and the look on her face was the look I had fallen in love with 40 years ago. The look that said she was exactly where she wanted to be, and she knew it. December came, the way December comes to Southern California, which is to say it came without much announcement, the days shortening and cooling, without the drama of autumn in other parts of the country, the light simply changing its quality from something bright and direct to something softer and more lateral. The jacarandas on our street stood bare. The roses in the garden had been cut back and covered for the season. On the first Monday of December, Calvin called to confirm the trial date. "We start on the 8th, he said. "Jury selection is already complete. Opening statements Monday morning." I told Maggie at dinner. She set down her fork and looked at the table for a moment, and then she looked at me. "I want to be in that room," she said, "the whole time." "I know," I said. "Is that going to be a problem?" "No," I said. "You're the reason we're there." The federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles is a building that takes itself seriously. It is not trying to impress you the way some civic buildings try to impress you with height or glass or the studied modernity of something that wants to signal importance. It is a building that has processed enough of the serious business of human consequence to have arrived at a kind of institutional gravity. The gravity of a place where things are decided that cannot be undecided, where the weight of evidence is measured against the weight of a life, and where the result, whatever it is recorded and final. I had been in courtrooms before, not often and not in circumstances like this. I sat in the third row of the gallery on the prosecution side, Maggie on my left and Nora on my right. June and Sam with a neighbor for the week. Calvin sat at the prosecution table, not as lead counsel, the federal prosecutors carried that role, but as a material witness coordinator, which meant he was the person who knew where every piece of evidence lived and could put his hand on any of it in 30 seconds. Elliot sat at the defense table across the aisle. He was wearing a charcoal suit I did not recognize, which meant he had bought it for this occasion, which struck me as the kind of detail that said something about a person, but I could not have said exactly what. His hair was shorter than I had seen it in years. He sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him, and his eyes forward, and in the 4 days of trial that had passed before this morning, jury selection had bled into the first week. He had not looked at Maggie or at me. Not once. I had watched for it. I am not sure what I expected to feel if he did look. I am still not sure. The lead prosecutor was a woman named Assistant United States Attorney Diane Reeves, which was not a name I will forget. She was compact and precise and delivered her opening statement the way the best construction managers deliver a project, briefing no wasted words, no performative drama, just the architecture of the case laid out with a clarity that made you understand exactly what had been built and how every piece connected to every other piece. She told the jury about Grayson Construction, about Maggie, about October 14th of 2014. She used the word deliberate 11 times in 40 minutes, and every time she used it, she was accurate. Elliot's attorney gave his opening statement afterward. I listened to it with the specific quality of attention you give to something you have been warned about. The diminished capacity argument was there dressed as Calvin had predicted in clinical language terms like compulsive patrimony, anxiety, and identity foreclosure disorder, things that sounded medicalized and serious and were designed to suggest that Elliot had been a man in the grip of forces larger than his own choices. His attorney was good. The argument was not good enough to be persuasive, but it was good enough to be heard, which was what it needed to be. Maggie listened to the diminished capacity argument without moving. I watched her from the corner of my eye. Her hands were in her lap, folded with the same careful stillness they had held at Calvin's conference table, at the kitchen table, in Nora's house, in her room at Cedarwood, through 4 years of Tennessee winters. She had a great deal of practice, my wife, at holding herself together while listening to things that were designed to unsettle her. When Elliot's attorney sat down, Maggie exhaled once slowly through her nose. Then she reached into her bag and took out the crossword she had brought, in case she needed something to do with her hands during the slower procedural stretches, and she set it on her knee and looked at it without picking up her pen. "You all right?" I said low enough that only she could hear. "Ask me when it's over," she said, which I recognized as the answer she gave when she needed to keep her focus narrow and forward and did not have bandwidth for anything outside that. The evidence days were methodical and cumulative in the way federal prosecutions tend to be, each witness a layer, each exhibit a confirmation of something the previous exhibit had suggested. The forensic document examiner took the stand and walked the jury through the signature analysis with the unhurried precision of someone who has explained complex things to non-expert audiences many times and has learned exactly how much detail serves clarity and how much overwhelms it. She had blown-up side-by-side comparisons of Maggie's authentic signature and the forged one on the share transfer mounted on boards, and she pointed to 11 specific discrepancies with a laser pointer while the jury leaned forward in the collective way. Juries lean when they are seeing something they understand is important. Sandra Merritt took the stand on the third day. She was 58 years old, and she wore a dark blue suit, and she answered every question in the measured, organized way of a woman who had been over this material many times with her attorney and knew exactly where she was going before each sentence began. She was not remorseful in any theatrical sense. She was cooperative in the thorough, detailed, irreversible way of someone who has made a decision and is executing it completely. Her testimony took 4 hours. Elliot's attorney cross-examined her for 90 minutes and did not land a single blow that changed the substance of anything she had said. When Sandra stepped down from the stand and walked past the defense table, Elliot looked at her for the first time during the trial. She did not look back. Nora testified on the 4th day. She was composed in the way I had come to understand was simply her nature, not performing composure, just built from it. She played the recording from her phone through the courtroom speakers, the recording she had kept for 5 years in 2 backup locations, and the voice of the man who had offered her $80,000 to disappear filled the federal courtroom in downtown Los Angeles with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Elliot's attorney objected to its admission 3 times. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had the particular patience of someone who has heard most things and been surprised by very little, overruled all 3 objections on federal evidentiary grounds. After court on the 4th day, Calvin walked with us to the parking structure on Hope Street. "How much longer?" Maggie asked. "The prosecution rests tomorrow," Calvin said. "Defense case 2 days maximum, given the motion record. Closing arguments, jury deliberation." He looked at her steadily. "1 more week, maybe 10 days. Maggie nodded. She was quiet for a moment, walking between Calvin and me in the particular coolness of a December evening in downtown Los Angeles. The city carrying on at its ordinary volume around us, indifferent and enormous and fully itself. "Calvin," she said. "Yes. Thank you." She said it simply, without elaboration, the way she said things that she meant completely and did not feel needed decoration. "For all of it. For 15 years, and for this." Calvin was quiet for a step or two. "Maggie," he said, "it's what I'm for." Maggie took the stand on a Wednesday. The defense case had lasted exactly 2 days, which was 1 day longer than Calvin had predicted, and considerably shorter than Elliot's attorney had implied it would be during jury selection. The 2 witnesses the defense called a forensic psychiatrist who testified about Elliot's psychological profile, and a former Grayson Construction board member who testified to Elliot's dedication to the company were competent and credible in the way that witnesses are competent and credible when the facts are not on their side. The psychiatrist's testimony was the diminished capacity argument in its fullest form, and the prosecutor cross-examined him for 3 hours and left him substantially less certain about his own conclusions than he had been when he started. The prosecution called Maggie as a rebuttal witness on Wednesday morning. She walked to the stand the way she walked through our garden, with purpose but without hurry, the pace of someone who has decided where she is going and sees no reason to rush the arrival. She was sworn in. She sat down. She adjusted the microphone the way you adjust something you intend to use properly. I sat in the 3rd row and watched my wife take the oath, and I felt something that I will not try to name because the names I have for it are all too small. AUSA Reeves took Maggie through the foundational questions. First her name, her marriage to Walter Grayson, her role at Grayson Construction, the events of October 14th of 2014, as she had experienced them. Maggie answered each question with the same level, direct quality she had brought to our kitchen table 6 weeks ago, and to Calvin's conference room, and to every conversation she had been part of since the morning in the park. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. She said what happened in the order, it happened in language clear enough that the 12 people in the jury box could follow it without effort. Elliot's attorney cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He was trying, I understood, to establish inconsistencies between her account and the documentary record places, where her memory of events diverged from dates or details in the formal record, which he could then use to suggest she was not a reliable narrator of her own experience. Maggie answered every question with a precision that left him very little to work with. She had, as she had told me once in the garden, spent a great deal of time thinking. Her memory of what had happened to her was not the fragmented, impressionistic memory of someone reconstructing trauma from a distance. It was the detailed, sequenced memory of a woman who had gone over the same events 10,000 times in a small room with nothing else to do until every element of it was as clear and fixed as something written down. He sat down after 40 minutes, looking like a man who had understood something he had hoped not to understand. Then, AUSA Reeves stood up for redirect. "Mrs. Grayson," she said, "the defense has raised questions about your identity throughout this proceeding. about whether the woman in the file under the name Eleanor Marsh and the woman sitting in this chair are in fact the same person. I want to give you the opportunity to address that directly." She paused. "How would you establish for this jury that you are Maggie Grayson?" The question settled over the courtroom, the way questions settle when everyone in the room has been waiting for them, without knowing it. Maggie did not answer immediately. She looked at A.U.S.A. Reeves. Then she looked at the jury. Then she looked down at her left hand, which was resting on the railing of the witness stand. She stood up. No one had asked her to stand. The judge looked up from her notes. Elliot's attorney started to rise with an objection forming, and then stopped because there was nothing to object to. Not yet, and the moment had a quality that made interruption feel genuinely wrong. Maggie stepped down from the witness stand. She walked across the open floor of the courtroom, 12 steps I counted them, without meaning to, toward the gallery where I was sitting in the third row. The courtroom security officer near the gallery rail shifted slightly, and then did not move further, because whatever was happening was clearly not a security matter, and clearly mattered very much. Maggie stopped in front of me. She reached out and took my right hand in both of hers and turned it gently so my wrist faced upward. Then she turned her own left wrist and placed it alongside mine, the inside of her wrist against the inside of mine, so that both tattoos were visible at the same time to anyone looking from the front of the room. I looked down at our wrists side by side. I had designed this image 35 years ago at a kitchen table with a woman I had just married, and I had thought I understood what it meant when I drew it, and I had learned over 30 years of marriage that I had only understood part of it, and then I had spent 14 years believing I would never understand the rest. But here in this courtroom in December of 2025, with 12 strangers leaning forward in a jury box and a federal judge setting down her pen and my son sitting 15 feet away, not looking at any of it, here was the rest of it. The two halves of the compass aligned. The broken needles pointed toward each other across the space between our wrists, two directions converging on a single point. The branches reached toward each other. The birds hers landing mine between faced each other across the gap, completing a conversation that had been interrupted for 14 years and was finishing now, in this room, in front of these people, because two small children in yellow jackets had run ahead on a path in a park in Pasadena on a Saturday morning in October. The courtroom was quiet, not the procedural quiet of a room following protocol. The other kind, the kind that happens when a room full of people has seen something that exceeds the available language and has decided collectively and without discussion to simply let it be what it is. The judge did not call for order. There was nothing to call. A U.S.A. Reeves said very quietly into the silence, "No further questions." The jury deliberated for 2 days. Calvin had told us to expect anywhere from 1 day to 1 week, depending on how the jury processed the volume of evidence, and that the length of deliberation was not reliably predictive of the outcome in either direction. I had nodded at this information and stored it in the part of my mind reserved for things that are true and useful and do not make the waiting any easier. Maggie and I spent those 2 days at home, not because we had been told to stay home, we had not, but because neither of us had any interest in being anywhere else. We ate at the kitchen table. We read in the same room without always talking. She went out to the garden in the mornings, and I brought her coffee, and we stood together in the December light, which in Southern California has a particular quality of clearness, a transparency that summer light does not have, as if the year has burned off everything unnecessary, and what remains is only what is true. On the second evening of deliberation, I found myself standing in the room that had been Elliot's when he was a boy. I did not go there deliberately. I was looking for a book I thought might be on the shelf in the hallway, and I opened the wrong door. And there it was, the room we had kept as a guest room for 20 years, but that still held in some quality of the light or the particular way the window sat in the wall, the memory of being someone's childhood bedroom. His baseball pennants were long gone. The desk where he had done his homework had been replaced with a guest bed, but the room still knew what it had been. I stood in the doorway for a while. Maggie came up behind me. She did not ask what I was doing. She stood beside me and looked at the room, and after a while she said, "He made choices, Walter, real ones, with full understanding of what they were." "I know," I said. "That's not a reflection of what you gave him, or what I gave him. We gave him everything we had." She paused. "Some people take what they're given and make something good with it. Some people take what they're given and make something else." Her voice was even and clear, and had in it the weight of a woman who had spent 14 years in a room with nothing to do but think about exactly this. We are not responsible for which thing he chose to make. I looked at the room for another moment. Then I pulled the door closed. Come have dinner, Maggie said. I made the chicken thing. The one with the lemon. The one with the lemon. I followed her downstairs and the room stayed closed behind us, and that felt like the right thing. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Calvin called us at 2:47 and said 2 words before anything else. Guilty, all counts. The federal charges against Elliot Grayson encompassed kidnapping under 18 United States Code, Section 1201, which carries a sentence of not less than 20 years when the victim is not released within 24 hours. Wire fraud under 18 United States Code, Section 1343, securities fraud, forgery of federal documents, and conspiracy to commit all of the above. The sentencing would happen in February after the pre-sentencing report prepared by the probation office was submitted to the judge. Calvin's estimate based on the federal sentencing guidelines and the nature and duration of the crimes was 25 to 30 years. Elliot was 45 years old. I sat in the kitchen chair, and I let that arithmetic settle the way you let something heavy settle when you have been carrying it and have finally put it down. Not relief exactly, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more complex. The feeling of a thing being over that you had never fully believed would be over arriving at its end, with less noise than you expected. Maggie was in the garden when Calvin called. I went out to tell her. She was standing at the rose beds not working, just standing with her hands at her sides and her face turned toward the late afternoon light. And when I came through the door, she turned and looked at me and read the answer in my face before I said a word. She nodded once, slowly. Then she turned back to the roses and stood there for a while longer, and I stood beside her, and the December light came through the garden, the way it always had, clear and true, and entirely indifferent to the 10,000 things that had happened under it. That evening, Nora came with June and Sam. She had bought a pie, which struck me as exactly the right thing to bring, and also completely insufficient for the occasion, which is the nature of the right thing in moments like this. June wanted to know everything that had happened. Asked 12 questions in 4 minutes and accepted summarized answers with the pragmatic flexibility of a child who understands she will get the full story eventually. Sam sat beside Maggie on the couch and leaned against her arm without saying anything, and she put her hand on top of his head, the way she had always done with Elliot when he was small, and I watched that and felt something move through me that I have no name for and do not need one. After pie, after the dishes, after June had fallen asleep in the armchair, with the total commitment of a child who has decided sleep is now, and here Nora sat across from me at the kitchen table while Maggie and Sam played chess in the living room. Someone asked me today, Nora said, what it felt like, knowing how it ended. What did you say? I said I didn't know yet. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. I think it's going to take a while to feel like something other than the thing that happened. I thought about that. A woman told me once, I said that some things have all before and an after, and the after is where you are now, still finding its shape. Nora looked at me. Did she figure it out? The shape? I looked through the kitchen doorway to the living room, where Maggie was moving a bishop across the board with the focused expression she always wore when she was 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. She's working on it, I said. We both are. Nora followed my gaze. She was quiet for a moment. Someone asked me something else today, she said. A reporter outside the courthouse. She asked if I thought the right person had been punished. What did you say to that? I said I thought the right people had found each other. Nora looked at her coffee. She didn't use that quote, too hard to put in a headline. I laughed. A real one from the chest, the first real one in, longer than I could accurately remember. Nora looked startled for a moment and then smiled the full kind, the kind that used her whole face. And from the living room, Maggie called out without looking up from the chessboard. Whatever he just said, he's right. He's usually right about the things that matter. Sam looked up from the board and back at the kitchen doorway with the expression of a child recalculating information. I thought you said he forgot things, Sam said to Maggie. He forgets where he puts his keys, Maggie said. That's different. The laughter that came then was the kind that fills a kitchen completely, the kind that doesn't need a reason beyond itself, the kind that a house makes room for when it has been waiting long enough. I sat at the kitchen table in the home I had built 30 years ago, with the woman I had spent 40 years loving, and I listened to the sound of it, and I thought about two small children in yellow jackets running ahead on a path in a park on a Saturday morning in October, pointing at a stranger's wrist, saying the truest thing they knew. And I thought some things are arranged, not by accident and not by plan, but by the accumulated weight of small acts. A nurse who asked one question, too many children who ran where they were told not to run, a man who sat on a bench long enough for the world to find him. Some things are arranged by all of that together, and sometimes, if you have been sitting on the right bench at the right moment, the world reaches back. Someone asked me after the verdict whether I had forgiven my son. A man outside the courthouse, not a reporter, just a man who had been in the gallery for the last 2 days, older than me, by the look of it, white-haired and carrying himself with the particular uprightness of someone who has decided that posture is a thing worth maintaining. He stopped me on the steps as I was coming down with Maggie beside me, and he looked at me directly and asked the question without apology or preamble, the way people ask things when they have been thinking about them long enough that the social courtesies have worn through. I did not answer him immediately. I looked at Maggie. She was looking at me with an expression that said she was curious about the answer too, which I found both surprising and entirely characteristic. I looked out at the December afternoon, the particular slant of the light, the cold clarity of a winter day in Los Angeles, that reminds you briefly that the city exists inside a real climate and not just a postcard of one. Down the steps, Calvin was on the phone, efficient and unhurried, already working on what came next. Across the plaza, Nora was buckling Sam into his jacket while June explained something at length to no one in particular. I thought about the question. Forgiveness, I have come to understand, is not an event. It is not a decision you make once cleanly and then carry forward as a completed thing. It is a practice the way tending a garden is a practice. You do not tend a garden one morning and declare it finished. You show up for it. You do the same work repeatedly. You accept that some things grow back that you did not plant, and some things you planted carefully never take, and the garden is not less real or less worth tending for any of that. I do not know yet whether I will forgive Elliot. I know that I am going to try. I know that trying is the most honest answer I have, and that I owe the honest answer to the question because it was asked honestly. What I know more certainly is this: Elliot made his choices. I made mine. Maggie made hers, the hardest ones, made in a small room in Tennessee with no good options and the full weight of love as the only currency she had to work with. Nora made hers at a cost I am still understanding and will spend years finding adequate ways to acknowledge. June and Sam made one on a Saturday morning in October, without knowing they were making it two children who ran ahead on a path, because that is what children do, because they were curious and fast and entirely unafraid of strangers, and because the woman who raised them had given them a world in which running toward things was safe and correct. None of us knew what we were arranging. That is the thing I keep coming back to. Not the dramatic things, the courtroom, the verdict, the morning Maggie walked back through the door of the house in San Marino. Those things matter, and they are real, and I will carry them. But what I keep returning to in the quiet mornings when the garden is still and the coffee is hot and Maggie is doing the crossword at the kitchen table with her glasses pushed up on her forehead is the ordinary things. A nurse who asked one question too many because something told her to, and who lost her job for it, and who made a choice in a parking lot to not leave without the person she had been asked to leave behind. A man who sat on a bench every Saturday for 10 years because the bench was the one place he did not have to pretend, and who was still sitting there on the right morning when the world needed him to be. Two children who ran ahead because the path was open and their legs were fast and the park was full of things worth running toward. These are the things that saved us, not the law, though the law did its work and I am grateful for it. Not the evidence, though the evidence was the mechanism. The things that saved us were smaller and older than any of that. They were the things that human beings do when they are paying attention to each other, when they notice, when they ask, when they stay, when they run ahead, without knowing what they are running toward. I thought about all of this on the steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles, while the older man waited for my answer patient, and unhurried with the courthouse at our backs and the December light falling across the plaza and Maggie's hand warm in mine. I'm working on it, I said finally. Forgiveness is something I'm working on. The man looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded one nod slow and complete the nod of a person who has been given an honest answer and recognizes it as such. He went his way. We went ours. Sentencing is in February. Calvin is prepared. Maggie is prepared. I am prepared in the way you are prepared for the last formal step of something that has already in all the ways that matter been resolved. After sentencing, there will be the work of rebuilding what was taken, not the company which has continued without interruption under interim leadership, and will be stronger for the transparency that comes from having its corruption exposed and removed. The rebuilding that matters is smaller and harder and does not have a legal name. It is the rebuilding of ordinary time, of Saturdays in the garden, of dinners that go long because nobody wants to stop talking, of Maggie's reading glasses on the kitchen counter, and the sound of her laughing at the end of a joke she started telling 3 minutes ago. These things are already here. They have been here since October. I do not take them for granted. I am not sure I am capable of taking them for granted anymore, and I think that incapacity, the inability to forget what their absence cost, is the most useful thing the last 14 years gave me. It is not a gift I would have chosen, but it is the one I have. There is something I have not told you yet. The Saturday after the verdict, Maggie and I went back to the park in Pasadena. Not because we planned to. We were driving going nowhere specific the way you drive sometimes on a Saturday, when the week has been heavy and the open road is a form of thinking. And we ended up on the street that runs past the park, and I pulled in without discussing it, and we parked and walked through the east gate under the oak tree whose shadow reaches the path by 9 o'clock, and we found the bench. Our bench, the one I had been sitting on for 10 years. We sat down together the first time I had ever shared that bench with anyone, and we did not say much for a while because the bench has always been a place for not saying much, and that did not need to change. The December park moved around us the same way the October park had moved 2 months before, full of dogs and joggers and young parents and the particular Saturday energy of a neighborhood going about its ordinary life. After a while, Maggie reached over and took my right hand in hers and turned it so the tattoo faced upward, and she placed her left wrist alongside mine the way she had done in the courtroom, and we sat there like that. In the December light, 2 people on a bench with their wrists together and their birds facing each other and the compass pointing home. There was no one watching, no jury, no gallery, no record being made, just us, just the park, just time doing what time does when you let it. A little girl, not June, a different child, 3 years old at most, in a red coat stopped on the path in front of us and looked at our wrists with the focused, serious attention of a very small person encountering something interesting. She looked for a long time. Then she looked up at us, and whatever she saw on our faces satisfied some question she had been asking internally because she nodded once with great seriousness and continued down the path. Maggie watched her go. She approved, Maggie said. She did, I said. Good, Maggie said. That's all I needed. I have been asked since all of this became known what I believe about the way it happened, about whether I think it was chance or something more than chance that 2 children ran to a bench on a Saturday morning and changed the shape of everything. I believe in God. I have believed in God for 72 years, through the good years and the long grief and the 14 years that were both at once in ways I am still sorting out. And what I believe about God is what I have come to believe about most things that matter, that God works in the material that is available. The material was a nurse who asked questions, 2 children who ran ahead, a man on a bench who had nowhere else to be. God used what was there. God uses what is there. That is, I have found enough. If this story has stayed with you, if some part of it has landed in a place that matters, I want to ask you to do something before you move on to the next thing. Not for me. For someone in your life who needs to know that the world is smaller and stranger and more generous than it appears on any ordinary Saturday morning. Share this story. Leave a comment and tell me what part of it you are still carrying. Subscribe to this channel because there are more stories. Like this one, stories about the ordinary things that turn out not to be ordinary at all, about the people who ask one question too many, and the children who run ahead, and the benches where the world finds you when you have been sitting still long enough. We are glad you are here. We are always glad you are here. I built a company with my hands. I raised a son with everything I had, and I still could not see the family betrayal happening inside my own home, carried out by the person who called me Dad. If there is one thing I want you to take from this family story, it is this: do not wait for a stranger's child to tell you what your own life is missing. Pay attention. Ask the hard questions before someone else is forced to ask them for you. I am not a man who gives advice easily, but I will say this: do not be like me. Do not let grief make you blind. Do not let trust become a door you forget to lock. Family betrayal does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in a briefcase in a quiet voice on a Tuesday morning when you're running late and you do not look back. God gives us the people we need, not always the people we expect. Sometimes a nurse, sometimes two children in a park. This is the family story I will carry for the rest of my life. If it stayed with you, leave a comment below and tell me which moment hit you hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that ordinary people can change everything, subscribe. We have more stories waiting for you. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. And one more thing, some of the stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely to carry a truth worth hearing. If that is not the kind of content you are looking for, I understand completely. Choose what is right for you. But if you stay, I promise we will make it worth your while.